Hi everyone. That will be the workshop about the motion analysis. So mostly the types of motion. I think Hadar already did about the burdens of proof. That will be some similar stuff, but I think that will be targeted to particular wordings and some kind of tips like what are the judges' expectations, how you can understood what are there, and how to also make effective prep time. If you were watching the workshop for the Astana EUDC, which I did about the prep time and the motions burdens, that will be very similar, and the presentation is almost the same. I just make the minor changes. So I don't think that there will be a lot of new information for you if you watched the previous one. I think there is some issues with the presentation, but I'll try to move forward. I will also link that later to the video. Resources used in the presentation, that's Athens UDC judging and speaking manuals, personal experience, and knowledge from the other workshop, written materials, tournament briefings, and other sources in debating. Table of content. So I think firstly, I will explain what is important in motions analysis and why it's worth to pay some of the attention to this. Second of all, about the information which you can gain from the judging manual and why there are useful tips, what judges should follow and how you should like read the motion, what are the some sort of expectation. Then some useful tips which you can implement to all types of motions, then the types of motions and some of the examples and explanation, and then the summary slide. I will try to do this within an hour. If there will be any questions or after, if you will watch the video, you'll have any questions, you can always approach me on Facebook or like other source of communication. I will definitely respond when I will have time. Okay, if you are let me just do this. If you are a novice debater, a lot of things which you're learning at the very beginning stays with you for good, and it's extremely important to make some step as the routine and keeping that practicing during our rounds, round one, round five, the finals, especially when you will be under stress or under pressure, when you will be in a bubble room, when you will not like the motion, when you will have different partner. I think it's always important to know that there are some steps required which you should do every time, regardless what kind of strategy later during prep you will pick. And I think a very important piece is the 7 minutes when people starting debating sounds like enormous amount of time. Like people after 4 minutes are like, oh my God, I just finished the motion. I'm like, I'm done with this. Why I have like 7 minutes? Or like people are after 2 minutes are like, but I just delivered 3 arguments. And I think sometimes when you develop certain skills and when you're understanding more and more the deeper analysis, the more perspectives and the actors or like what kind of links you need to include, then 7 minutes, it's extremely limited amount of time to deliver the case, especially when you are debating on the top half, when you're doing the prime minister's speech, when the motion is policy, when you need to explain the definitions, but also you need to deliver the positive content. Similarly, when you are a leader of the opposition. I think motions analysis gave you the ability to know what it's necessarily for you to deliver, how you should put the priorities, or what are the important links for your case to be comparative and to not be off clash, like things which the motion didn't change much, which both sides can claim, or something which will be not important in the end. This is also important notification about the speaker point. So a lot of people with which I'm talking, it's like, I can't go over 75 speaker points, or why I can't go over 80, why my average it stay in that level, or like why I get only like 72 or something. So I think it's extremely important to know that if you have the logical gaps within your case, and if you're lacking the significant the significant portion of the analysis, then it's super hard to go to 79, 82 bracket or higher. And it's hard for judges to justify why you should get that number. I think when you're following the motion analysis, if you're following the burdens, if you're explaining the premise to your case, if you are making the important links, it's much easier later to fight for this higher speaks, which might be important, even for self-esteem, even if we are all repeating to ourselves that speaks are not that important. Later, when you're looking for the speaker tab, it's obviously like you wanted to do better next time. And I think this is important tool which help people to improve. And this is something which also helped me to improve and go bracket higher or like higher average with the next competitions. Let's do the next slide. Judging manual quotes. So what I will do now, it's there will be some quotes from the judging manuals, which are usually very similar for Euros, ABP, Worlds, and other majors. The importance is all of the people need to follow these manuals, and all of the people should be recognize what are the rules and what you need to do in the debating. So I think here is the first premise, which is important for speakers, that teams win debates by being persuasive with respect to the burdens their side of the debate is attempting to prove within the constraints set by the rules of BP debating, which automatically force judges that you will be not persuasive, even if you will speak the best plausible language, even if you put a lot of context, if you will not go with the rules of BP debating, or if you will not respect the burdens which you have on your side of the house, which we will be talking more about that in a detail later. But I think this is important at starting point. Assessing the arguments. The outcome of the debate should depend on what the team said. Judges must not intervene in the debate, do not invent arguments for team, do not complete arguments, and do not rebut arguments. Sounds very easy, but a lot of people, including myself, many times, you have in your head, oh my God, this is so obvious that freedom is important, or like, oh yeah, security is something important. Like, I don't need to explain why, or like, they get what I mean. Bad things will happen, and stuff like this will happen, or like yada, 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 examples. And you need to remember that people who are listening to you, usually that multiple people in the panel, and you need to analyze the motion on the average level. So you want to convince all of them. So assuming, for example, you are debating the motion in general about the politics. In your panel, you have the person from Poland, person from Malaysia, and person from United States. It's unclear, for example, why if you give the example from your national politics, which might be, I don't know, Belarus, or which might be Australia, or which might be Nigeria, or any other country, people will be like, oh yeah, I get what that means. I understood, because this is something which I read in my newspaper. This is something which history I'm familiar. A lot of issues why the argument it's not persuasive for judges, or why it's not fitting the emotion, it's because people don't understand what you are trying to say, or people arguing and trying to put the interpretations. And I think the analogy is good when you are watching TV series and you have a lot of fandoms which are creating what this person means, or like what this episode means, or like what is the deep meaning of this sentence, or like what is the behavior of this particular character. And then when people on the forum discussing, you are reading this and like, oh, I completely differently understood this point. And the issue in that particular slide and this particular part of this workshop is you need to complete your sentence to be clear enough to follow. So people, after you finish speaking, they should have some kind of vision what you are talking about and some kind of assessment. So when you're analyzing the motion, try to speak like you are talking to the child, which never ever heard the sentence before. Later, when you will be like more skilled and like when you will have more experience and you will get some also fluency with the language and you will be capable to convince people without using very, very detailed analysis, then you can skip that part and jump to like mechanisms directly. But when you are starting, it's crucially for people to be capable to see what you are trying to say. If you have any questions, please write in the chat. I think I should see this and I will try to respond immediately. Let me just check if I didn't skip any slide. Okay, we should not consider how important we think a particular argument is in the abstract, but rather how important it becomes in particular debate. Here is the thing. A lot of people watching a lot of workshops, and also we are doing a lot of practices in online debating, or like people doing tournament every weekend, and the motions are similar or clashes are similar. But people didn't read the motions word by word, or didn't spend significant amount of time to explain why some case which you used 2 weeks ago, which you won the debate, it's still relevant in this motion. I think a lot of motions which starting in developing countries or in countries with lack of democracy, or with countries with high rates of crime, or in situation in which when giving you particular context and then there needs to be assessment of this debate to the particular debate. So people should be sure after your speech that they are judging this motion and not the similar motion which they saw like 2 weeks ago or something. And this is the burden usually on speakers, because sometimes the abstract arguments will be less persuasive than something which feeling the burden of the motion, which is within the context which the motion setter imposed on the debaters. It's important to recognize that there are different mechanisms for persuasion, but they are means to the same end. So good analysis, good rebuttal, good strategic decision, and using the examples. An analogy to this by using examples, it's what I was doing with the IR motions. So when I was a novice, we broke to the semifinal of like Polish competition, and there was a motion about the Senkaku Island. And by that time, my knowledge about Senkaku Island was basically zero. My opening opposition still everything what I can assess from the motion. And the question then become, are you capable to tell the story of your case or trying to make the case, explaining something which you understand and try to reflect that in the debate. So when you're talking about some two rivalry countries which are fighting for some kind of territory and trying to explain how that might affect one of them, even if you will not win the debate, sometimes you just need to take a second to get there. Or during the prep, when you are thinking about how to analyze the IR motion, which is, for example, your degree or in your field, which you are doing during your classes, for example, or you know a lot about Israel or like about the Middle East in general, or about like the India. But then during the debate, judges didn't have the same amount of knowledge as you, but also you are a bit biased towards your knowledge and you are trusting to yourself a lot. So you need to find a way how to fit these examples, how to make good strategic decisions. So every time when you are delivering the piece of knowledge, which you think it's crucial, which you can shine that you know that kind of things, which probably might give you better and more detailed case, you need to finish that by explaining how this analysis fit to the motion. Why the data which you are providing about this conflict or about this particular scenario, it's important for your argument to stand, or like how on the comparative that's work. So the conclusion from this slide is, if you are talking about some kind of issues which you have more knowledge or which you don't have a knowledge, trying to find a good way to sell this and always back to the burdens in the motion or to the sentence from the motion why you think this is something crucial, especially when the motion is the comparative motion. So you can't pick A over B only. So you don't have option C, you don't have option D, you can't discuss any abstract solution. So it's extremely important to remind to judges and to remind to teams in the room that this is the only comparison which matters, and that's how on which metric you are proving your case. Now there are useful tips. Are there any questions to the first part? Okay, so I will move to useful tips to all motion types. That's based on me judging a lot of competition and some common mistakes which I found. And especially that matters in a close debate. So assuming that all four teams provide some sort of argument, some sort of rebuttal and mitigation, then there are the questions how well the arguments are delivered and how well the motions are analyzed. So the first question is the proportion. It's the proportion. So I think when people trying to claim the large impacts, like how you change the world or like how you will empower a particular group of people, but you are not sacrificing some sort of material, or the mechanism which we're trying to use compared to the status quo, it's not very strong, or like didn't reflect somehow how you might get that kind of outcomes. It's really unclear why a lot of things which you are claiming will happen in the debate. So I think especially for policy motions, every time when you want to achieve your goal, you need to ask yourself what needs to be done for me to this goal to happen, and why something might be tipping point for the people to change their patterns of behavior, or how that might change some kind of incentives from the leaders of the countries, or why the business will be likely to move. So that's applying to the motions about the environment, about urbanization policy, about housing. So when you want to get large impacts, you need to go big. If you are claiming very small mechanisms, or like 1% change, or like just like information campaign, there's unclear why you will achieve any of your benefits, which means that your case is not persuasive, which means that strategically it's unbelievable. Even if you will analyze why this will be good for the society, if I don't believe that that will happen, I will probably credit the other case a bit more. The second one is the plausibility. And especially in the motions about the pandemic, in the motions about the democracy or like election, this is not the science fiction novel sometimes. And I feel that I also did the same, that sometimes people are doing the arguments which you will never see in real life, or which you might see in one example, which is like not following the rule, which is like a very specific example. So I think in terms of plausibility, ask yourself the question, if that will be done, if that will happen, are you capable to imagine the situation on the streets? Are you imagine yourself reading about that in a newspaper? Are you imagine seeing people reacting in the way which you're describing in your motion? So I think there, even if you will not have spectacular case, even if that will be not the most fancy case in life, that will be something which I'm capable as average citizen, average voter, average judge to imagine and assert that this is plausible to achieve. Worst, better, comparative. I think there is difference between alternatives exist, or that's the comparative. Because if the situation is bad now, can always be worst, and you can analyze why it will be worst. So there is not a good rebuttal to say, oh, but situation is so bad that we need to take the risk and we need to change something. And if op will say, yeah, but you will piss people who are currently supporting you, you will antagonize other sources, you will stop the progress. That's a lot of situations which make your solution worse than its situation is already. So people need to be aware of that and need to respond to that kind of attacks and make some sort of weighing. Oh, and here is something which is not very obvious and something which is smart. So a lot of motions, they will not show the effects or the most important impacts tomorrow after implementation happen. Or some motions require huge discussion later. So I will use now like the personal example from the huge discussion which happening in Poland right now. So we have a massive protest about the abortion law. And a lot of people who are against the abortion are like, we are protecting the life of the children because we have one of the most restrictive abortion law in the world and in Europe per se. And we changed the law to make also like the issues with the fertility if the child might die immediately after being born, that will ban the abortion in that stages, but also they wanted to ban the abortion even further with the cases of rape, etc. A lot of shit. And a lot of people who are trying to arguing with us, like people who are supporting the abortion law, are saying, oh, but you like we need to protect the life of the children because this is important. But they never actually respond to the question, but what will happen the week, 2 weeks, the month, 6 months, or a year after this child will be born? Like, who will give the money for survival? Like, who are taking care about people with disabilities? Who will help the people go over mental health trauma or like all of these situations? People didn't think about the long-term perspective sometimes. And I think in many debates that's happened as well. Like people are capable to analyze the incentives, or why we should do a particular policy, but didn't really consider what kind of outcomes and effects that will have in the future after the policy will be like considered by people. Also, like the emotions, like this house would start English as a primary language of instructions in some countries. Of course that the first 3 or 5 years will be problematic of implementing this policy, yes. But after 5 years, the new generation, there will be probably something normal, right? So there will be not that strong backlash. So I think it's important to analyze how in the long term the policy will be enacted, like how people will be reacting, and then make the balance of things. So I think this is also extremely important.
Excuse me. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you please show me the previous one?
Yep.
Previous.
But I will also post this to the
No,
presentation
not this
later.
one. Previous one. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay.
Sure. So I will wait 10 seconds and then we'll go. Okay. Can I move now?
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure.
Okay, cool. Okay. So this also applying to all of the motion types and in general to all of the debates. Proving the premise and assumption to the case. Usually people are jumping directly into impact because this is something which you can assert automatically. So when you are standing in the auditorium, or when you are seeing the motion posted, you are like, oh yeah, this is about what this debate will be about. Like, we need to say this, or we'll say that. The question is how you will came to your thing that will happen before you start weighing or other things. So you need to explain why it's likely to happen and why people will act in the particular way. Important. If you will not explain the premise and if you will not prove that things will happen, you will not get credit for the future stuff. And this is something which a lot of people, especially in Europe, calling like Israeli style of judging, which are very harsh with speaker points and putting a lot of strong emphasis on the analysis and line by line delivering the case. So I think people should always have that in mind, but especially when there are when they are in a strong room against the strong teams, which executing very well the premises and proving the cases, and then doing the weighing on already existing thing. So I think the analogy to this might be with cooking. So if you have the recipe how to make a chicken, and like you have the best recipe ever, like master chef, like your plate should look perfectly, you are seeing the pictures and you are telling the people what they will be capable to see, but the other team will just make the more basic recipe but will be capable to provide that on the plate already. It's kind of obvious that people believe in something which they are seeing directly and not something which maybe, but maybe not, I'm unsure, or like how even. So I think there is super important to put more emphasis and more focus on this part than the impact. Let's go forward. Okay, this is what I learned from some of my debates. So I'm the person who had very bad luck in terms of outruns positions. So when I started breaking, especially at Polish competitions, every time I end up doing opening government, which was my hated position. Especially opening government, it's very tricky when you are tired, when it's like 6 p.m., when it's after dinner, which is 8 p.m., or even now with the time zones when it's just like completely different time when your brain is not really focused, that people didn't read the motions exactly with every single word, or didn't write it down, or didn't make the picture, and didn't follow the wording step by step. And I think sometimes there is a massive difference if you will miss one word from the particular motion, because that's change your burdens and change something which the motion requires from you to do. How it looks like. So if the motion is, this house prefer a world where starting tomorrow, women can shoot lighting from their fingertips. This is not the same motion as this house believes that women should have a right to shoot lighting. Because you need to analyze how the world which we know already, and when tomorrow people will wake up with superpowers, how the reaction will happen. So probably the people who are now in power, and like a lot of like misogynists, or like people who didn't like women and didn't enjoy their power, or people who are currently in power, they didn't want to be like, oh yeah, you have a lighting from your hands, like I automatically give you 80% of and I will allow you to do a lot of things. So the starting tomorrow gave the different types of burden on the teams. This house, as someone with hyper empathy, would not use that bill. So you need to know that someone with hyper empathy, it's already the characterization that you are not the average citizen, that you are not the regular person. And you need to change a bit the characterization of this, right? But you can't assert how this person will behave, but you need to analyze why this hyper empathy, how this reflected in some decision in life, and what kind of difference that making. The other, it's this house would allow children to sue their parents for religious indoctrination. And here is the thing, even if the government side will analyze perfectly why children should have a right to challenge their parents, why parents made a lot of damage with religious indoctrination, it's still unclear why suing the parents is the mechanism which should be implemented. So you need to be very careful what is your burden. In this motion, you can perfectly explain that the religious indoctrination is bad. And OP can be like, oh yeah, religious indoctrination is horrible, but imagine suing this parent and making this even more horrible. We have different mechanisms or like different ideas how to do this. And then they are literally not engaging with you in the clash is this is something important. So I think then you need to be sure that you are explaining the process of suing and not necessarily the problem within the motion. This house would actively encourage women to not have children. Like, you can't claim a lot of impacts that, oh, we will have the empowerment, we will save the planet, or like we will stop the like booming population, if you will not explain what this actively encouraging means, B, to which extent that will be successful, right? So your burden of proof, it's not to say, why women not having children, it's a good thing, but how actively encouraging women to not have children will happen, and why they need this encouragement, why this active encouragement is legitimate, etc. This how would subsidize art that glorified the working class. Again, you can say that the glorification of the working class is good, but the question is, the subsidizing of this art, it's okay, because like spending money in one direction, taking money from the other direction, or money is also a strong incentive and can change how the art is performed. So again, you need to be very careful for which questions you're responding. This house regrets the glamorization of the startup culture that encourages people to start their own companies rather than pursue traditional career paths. So on the government side, you can't just claim that glamorization of startup culture is great, and that's encouraging people to do their own companies, but also OP can't just attack the glamorization without defending the traditional career paths. So that's the typical comparative motion, and you need to be very sure that you have some common metrics and you have the sticking points how you can like compare these two solutions. No questions still. Okay. This house believes that the creation of feminist icons and their cults of personality are good for the feminist movement. So again, this is not the question what is good for women. This is not the question what is good for the population or society, but for the feminist movement. So you need to link all of your arguments and explain how they are playing for this group of people, for this particular movement, which is also extremely important to be on the clash. This house regrets mainstream commercial films that depict historical subjugation and crimes against humanity. You are not regretting document films. You are not regretting the reporting from this historical subjugation. You are opposing or like regretting the commercial films. So this is also the difference. So you can't claim that you are regretting absolutely every single piece of material, because OP will be like, no, this is not your burden, and like this is not our burden to like to need it to support all of this. So this is also extremely important. Cool. Before we move on to types of motions, any questions to the previous part? Okay, cool. I will wrap it up here a bit because I have quite detailed slides. So you can always read to that and ask me questions. So motions of the forum, this house would do X, involve the government arguing that they should be enacting policy X. A policy is a contract course of action that government teams wish to convince the judges should be implemented. Such motions are about whether the house should do X, with government teams arguing that they should and opposition teams arguing that they should not. For the purpose of the debate, the government teams are the government and the politicians that make it up. And the debate is about whether they should or should not do a policy, not whether their real world counterparts will or will not. It should be assumed that the policy will be implemented in the manner that the government teams set up, also known as government fiat. As such, it is never a valid line of opposition to such motion to state that but the government would never do this, or more subtly, but politicians would never pass this law. This is super important to remember, but here I think we should have some examples. For policy motion, opposition teams may choose to defend status quo or propose an alternative in the form of a counterprop. It is not necessary for opposition team to present a counterprop, thought it might be beneficial in some instances. And here is the important thing, because a lot of teams are taking counterprop as a new funny trend, but not necessarily following what kind of responsibilities they're taking on their team. So if presenting a counterprop, opposition teams are granted the same amount of fiat power that government teams have. The debate should assume that whatever counterprop opposition proposes will also be implemented, And it would be similarly futile to argue that opposition's counterprop would never be passed by any parliament in real life. However, it is crucial to note that opposition's policy should not take significantly more resources to achieve than government's policy, but also explain, if that's different solution, why it's likely to be better taken by people and why it's likely to satisfy more groups of people. So you also need to make that this policy, it's likely to being accepted by the population and being like positively approached. Burdens and tips in that types of motions. So this is something which is not from the manuals, but this is something which I wrote, so you can pay more attention to this slide. Not only reasoning why we should do this and why this is the right thing to do. So a lot of things might be done and a lot of like problems might be solved. Your responsibility in this motion, it's why this particular thing is the right thing to do and what kind of outcomes and consequences there need to be dealt with. So when you are analyzing this, fiat, it's not equal to how the change will happen. What does it change? How people will react? What is the benefit of this? So assuming you have a fiat to implement like higher tax on meat, like people will accept, yeah, you gave the reasoning that there is a lot of vegetarian people, that animals are suffering, that there's a lot of pollutions and other reasoning. It doesn't explain how people will react, how market will react with other prices of the other products. What does it change in the consumer behavior? What are the benefits of this? So even if you implement something, the reaction might be different. So you need to analyze this. So that's how you analyze the motion in that particular instance. Comparative, not why this is a good idea and might be successful, but why it's also better than the other alternatives. Then you can use different metrics. Might be faster, might be more certain, might be more equal for other people. You just need to think what the other side can say on your solution. And as we talked before, this is just like a reminder, in this motions, proportionality is crucial, and you can propose self-change to not be accused of creating some harms by opposition, and simultaneously claim, you can't, there should be like disclaimer, I just found the mistake in my presentation. And simultaneously claim that this marginal change will make massive impacts on people's decision and life. You need to explain why there is a tipping point of your case and why people organization will follow this model, especially when you are creating like huge shift in the public opinion on Overton window and the other arguments which people like to run. I'm not seeing questions, so I'm going forward. Example, this house would impose gender and racial quota government cabinets. This house would hold government officials criminally responsible for severe harm to citizens resulting from grossly negligent public policy. This house would pay additional benefits to families on welfare according to their child's performance in school. This house would require that government ministers will be highly qualified and experienced experts in their policy areas. I think if you want to do some training or like some exercise after this workshop, you can try to analyze these motions, and you can feel free to consult with me if you want to do this. But I don't think that I should do this alone or like asking you and making full stops here, especially when there will be recording later. But as I said, I have some time since I'm sitting at home now quite a long, so I can respond and help. So feel free to do this from whatever type of motion which I will be posting here. Analysis motions. So the motions that open this believes that X or value judgment debate, they require government teams to argue for the truth of the statement represented by X, whilst opposition team argue that X is false. If you will ever debate against Hadar or with Hadar, every time when the motion is the analysis debate, she will definitely remind you about that. That's what I learned from speaking with her at some at some competitions. So and people are weaponizing this, that you can't claim something's obvious, but you need to analyze why there is likelihood of that happening, and whether the statement is true, or whether they should do anything about the statement, as you see in the example about the Trump does more harm than good. So you can ban Trump, you can analyze some other things. You need to find the metric which will explain what are the harms, what are the goods, and how you can judge between this. Government teams do not need to have a policy. They should, however, still define terms within the debate. In this case, they should provide a metric for how more. Examples. This House believes that prominent civil society activists should choose not to run for elected office. This House believes that liberal media organizations should actively glorify democratic candidates of color. This House believes that the environmental movement should adopt the message of eco-optimism rather than pessimism. Important note to that kind of motion. Look, the first wording. This House believes that prominent civil society activists should choose not to run for elected office. They should not choose as well. So it's not only by saying why this particular people shouldn't be in the elected office, but why some sort of the privilege which they might have should also prevent them from taking the positions which might be granted for them. Let's also apply to the motion like this House believes that the privileged women in feminist movement should not take the leader positions. They should not take. So you also need to arguing how from their perspective the situation looks like, what are the alternatives for them, because this is also the part of the debate. Let's move forward. Motions that's open, this House supports oppose, also usually need not involve government proposing a policy. Instead, the government teams need to argue that they would either symbolically, politically, materially, or in some other manner, which should be defined, support the person, group, institution, cause, idea, value, or statement expressed by X. Opposition need to argue that X should be not supported in that way. So it's important to have the clear comparative for government team to explain what the support actually means. Is that the financial support? Is that that's usually depends what is in the motion, but it's also important for op to clarify this if the teams forgot. That helps with the analyzing the cases and analyzing the debate and the motion as a whole. This House opposed the idealization of parenthood. This House support Asian NATO. This House opposed the dominant social norm in favor of monogamy. This House supports countries withdrawing from the International Criminal Court in order to create their own regional replacements. I mean, in that motion, you have clearly said what the support means, that you support that because they have alternative source. So you probably, your burden is to defend the regional replacement as the comparative debate. So we also need to be aware and read that kind of things. This House supports academic tracking. Tracking is separating students by academic ability. So when you are not supporting tracking, you are not supporting this way of separating students. So you also have driven the comparative. A lot of people in the motion this House supports sometimes forgot that they also need to be comparative, that you are supporting something compared to the other solution. So this is also important to keep that in mind. Motions that open this House prefer a world in which X are debates which require a comparison of a world containing X or demonstrating X phenomenon to the status quo. The government teams must argue that the statement is true, and the opposition teams argue that the statement is false. Again, there is no need for government teams to propose a policy for this kind of motion. Take, for example, the motion this House prefer a world in which all people have superpowers. Government must argue in favor of the motion in comparison to the status quo. opposition teams cannot invent a new world as a point of the comparison. That is, it would be illegitimate for opposition to argue instead that they would prefer a world when only good people have superpowers, or a world where only politicians have superpowers. They must defend the status quo as a point of the comparison. Extremely important in that types of motion, you need to explain to people how this world will look like, and then explain the impact, the benefits, because it's really hard sometimes when you skip some points of the analysis to believe that this is actually how the world will change and that this is the right solution. Examples, and again, I will just remind you are free to try to make the exercise for yourself, written down arguments and consult with me or text me. It's fine. It's just not many people on this call and many people join in the middle. So I just don't want to prolong this. But as I said, I'm happy to chat later. This house prefer a world in which wealth is seen as shameful. This house prefer a world without organized religion. Probably something will still happen with religion. So if not organized religion, explain what instead. If the world in which wealth is seen as shameful, explain what you mean by shameful, how these people will be subjected of the attention. This house prefer a world when all romantic relationships are consensually polyamorous. Explain how this consensus will happen, this polyamorous, how that's changed the status quo, how people perceiving polyamorous relations now, what generate the problems, and why all romantic relations should follow that trend. Some motions may open this house prefer X to Y. In these debates, the opposition is expected to defend Y as preferable to X, not the status quo. For example, if the motion is this house prefer a world in which all individuals own Mercedes cars to a world in which nobody owns any Mercedes car, opposition must defend a world in which nobody owns any Mercedes cars as opposed to the status quo, where some individuals own Mercedes and others do not. But if you will read the motion, you will know that that's how ethics works. And we are back to the beginning of this workshop. Motions that open this house to regret ask whether the world would have been a better place without the existence of X. In this debate, all teams are debating with the benefit of hindsight, which is important. Unless in the motion it's said that there is the year like that one, and then that's suggesting that you don't have information from the hindsight. The harms or benefits that teams are attributing to X have already occurred. Teams must also describe how an alternative world that developed without X occurring would look like. This is also known as a counterfactual. For example, with the motion, this house regrets the rise of hookup culture. Teams should not just debate the merits or demerits of hookup culture. Instead, they should consider what the alternative to hookup culture developing is likely to be. For instance, the government could argue that the alternative is everyone being in long-term meaningful relationships, and opposition could dispute the alternative and forward an alternative of their own. To further clarify, in such debates, opening government cannot use their definitional power to set the counterfactual. Rather, they have to argue its likelihood. So you always need to argue the likelihood. That's basically the importance about the debating, which help later to take and understood and credit you for the arguments being made. Examples. This regrets the narrative to glorify elderly. This house regrets the use of the term moderate Muslim by Muslims to identify themselves. This house regrets the corporate sponsorship of LGBT pride parades. If you're interested, by the way, to this second motion, there's a lot of great sources in internet. How this term was perceived by the Western world, by the Muslims themselves, a lot of analysis especially after like few years when that was implemented. So I'm strongly recommending to looking into that sources if you are interested in the topic. This house believes that it should, and about whether or not the statement is true from the perspective of a net neutral observer. Even though these motions are praised as true or false statements, government teams are encouraged to implement a policy. Take as an example the motion, this house believes that the US should sanction Saudi Arabia. While it is possible for teams to debate the merits and demerits of sanction in abstract, the debate would be made much clearer if government teams present a policy outlining what sanctions entail, what kinds of sanction would be implemented, and so on. So even if this is not the policy debate, it's much easier and much better if you explained how this sanction will look like to increase the probability of your impacts occurring and the reaction which you are expecting the countries to make. Opposition may also present the alternative. Examples: this house believes that the government should make available a publicly searchable database containing the income, wealth, and taxes paid by all citizens. The companies should adopt the practice of radical transparency. States should force big tech firms, Microsoft, Facebook, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, to disclose the identity of potential patients and carriers of highly infectious disease based on their online activities. The EU should allow member countries that have experienced consistent significant negative migration to place barriers on their citizens migrating to other EU member countries. Types of motions. The last one, it's the actor motions. Motions that open this house as A would do X are somewhat special. These motions are more specific about the entity A doing X, and so invite a closer examination of the perspective of the entity about what they should do, with all teams arguing from actor A's perspective. Instigating these motions should therefore consider what actor A's knowledge, values, abilities, and interests are, and explain why the motion is or is not actor A's best interest. Unlike previously discussed debates, actor debates are not necessarily about whether or not X actions is necessarily best for the world. But second, and this is super important, even if OG is not very detailed, that they are linking and they are not constantly repeating, this is the actor motion, so that's it's our case. There's not enough for closing team to be like, oh, this is actor motion, so we will take the same mechanism, the same line of analysis, but we will link that to the actor. Then still, the team from the top half will get much more credit for this particular case. Hello. Okay. It is important to note that at this point that prioritizing actor A's perspective is not the same as assuming that actor A only cares about their own interest. Most, if not all, actors hold moral beliefs and principles and will act to actualize those beliefs. Thus, debaters should feel free to make principled arguments in actors' debates, in addition to more practical arguments, so long as they are able to explain why the actor in question holds those specific principled beliefs. So if, for example, the motion is, this house as a parent would not send their child to private school, this debate should take place from the perspective of a parent, as both the proposed agent to make a decision about the education of their child and the proposed target of argumentative appeals. By contrast, the motion is how parents should not send their children to private schools. The motion does not take place solely from the perspective of the parent. Instead, the debaters are simply trying to convince the judges of the truth of the statement from a neutral perspective. In such a debate, government teams would first have to explain what the interests of the parent are, and then explain why not sending their child to private schools meet those interests. So that's the difference in terms of weighing in particular types of motion. In response, opposition teams can do two things. They can either agree with government teams about the interest of the parent and argue that the proposed course of action does not meet those interests, or they can argue that parents have different interests than the interests raised by the government team, and that this new set of interests can be better met by sending their children to private school. Note here that the interest of the parent can be practical, wanting their child to succeed, or principled, a broad interest in the principle of equality. Judges should not automatically rule out any claim about principle or practical interest of actors unless there is no convincing explanation as to why such interest matters from the point of view of the actors. Examples. This house has the Catholic Church, which publicly punished priests for clear deviations from its faith doctrine and practices. This house, as Japan, would support closing all US military bases on Japanese territory. You are a CEO of a major clothing company and currently pay workers in your factory $1 a day. You are presented with a plan that would give your employees a dignified living wage. This would significantly increase production costs, but would not put you out of business. This house would implement the plan. Summary slide. And then the times for questions, if you will have any. Effective prep time needs to fulfill expectation of CAs while setting a motion. Read carefully wording. That's also mean effective analysis and effective motion delivery. Effective prep time, which it's one of the base to like successfully making which might be interpreted in different way by different people, need to respond to open questions, not create additional ones, and control your case delivery, because it's the burden on the debater to be sure that people understood the case delivery in a way in which debater have that in their head. Effective prep time need to respond to the comparative, can be spent on create cases in a vacuum, but in the framing of the debate. Effective prep time need to have clear strategy using proportional mechanisms to impact and not contradict your own points while rebutting the other side. Effective prep time should prepare cases with good sales strategy. Judges should be able to visualize this on general level, not only best case debate lunch scenario. So the phrase of like effective prep time, it's just coming from the previous workshops, which I used the slides, but I think it's perfectly applying to the motion types and the motion analysis per se. And that will be it from my presentation. I will, of course, send you the link, so you will have the ability. To see this. And if you have any questions, you can ask now. If not, you can text me later if you will have any questions, or if you want to consult some examples of ideas to the motions presented, or if you have any other matter, it's nice, like a few minutes that you can ask. So if you have a question, you can write in the chat and then I will ask you. Yeah. No problem. So I will head off. That will be recorded on YouTube. There will be also a link to this workshop. As I